Setagaya Family Murders, Tokyo, Japan, 2000. In the final hours of the 20th century, one of Japan's most disturbing unsolved murder cases took place. On December 30th, 2000, in the quiet, middle-class neighborhood of Setagaya in Tokyo, the Miyazawa family, Father Mikio, Mother Yasuko, and their two young children, 8-year-old Naina and 6-year-old Rei, were brutally murdered inside their own home. The case, still unsolved more than 2 decades later, has baffled police and haunted the country with its sheer brutality and the bizarre behavior of the killer. The Miyazawas lived in a semi-detached house bordering a park. The area had been scheduled for redevelopment, and most of their neighbors had already moved out, leaving the surroundings eerily quiet. On the morning of December 31st, 2000, a relative visited the home after not hearing from the family and discovered a horrific scene. All 4 family members had been killed during the night. Mikio's body was found at the foot of the staircase, showing signs of a violent struggle. He had suffered multiple stab wounds, especially to the neck and face. Upstairs, Yasuko and Nina were stabbed in their beds, while little Rei had been strangled in his room, possibly to keep him quiet while the killer dealt with the others. The killer had initially brought a sashimi knife to the scene, but it broke during the attack. He then took a kitchen knife from the Miyazawa's own home and continued the spree. What happened after the murders is what makes this case even more chilling. Instead of fleeing, the killer remained in the house for hours. He used the family's computer to access the internet, visited websites, and possibly even checked emails. He helped himself to food from the fridge, including ice cream and melon. He used the toilet multiple times and didn't bother to flush. He even took a nap on the family's couch. Evidence left behind included bloody clothes, a hip bag, a knife sheath, and even feces. Forensic analysis of the evidence showed that the killer was a male, likely of mixed Asian and European descent. DNA testing suggested his mother had Southern European or North African ancestry, while his paternal line was East Asian. The sand found inside the killer's hip bag traced back to the Nevada desert, near Edwards Air Force Base in California, suggesting the killer may have had some connection to the U.S. military or acquired the items secondhand. One particularly chilling detail is the killer's use of the internet while still inside the house. He accessed several websites, including a Japanese theater company's page, and remained active online for hours. This suggested that the killer was comfortable, even relaxed, in the aftermath of his gruesome act. Despite collecting over 12,000 pieces of evidence and having the killer's fingerprints, police have never matched them to anyone. The clothing worn by the killer was traced to a specific brand, and only a limited number of those items were sold in Japan. Surveillance and sales records were examined, but no lead ever materialized. Over the years, Japanese police have interviewed over 300,000 people and followed up on more than 12,000 tips. A composite image of the suspect was never released to the public, and authorities have kept many details close to the chest, hoping the real killer will one day be caught off guard. One of the leading theories is that the killer was not Japanese, perhaps a foreigner or someone who had lived overseas. Others believe he may have been someone with mental illness, capable of extreme violence, and not concerned about the consequences. The lack of a clear motive has added to the confusion. Nothing was stolen from the home, and the killer didn't attempt to cover his tracks, despite leaving an abundance of evidence. Every year on the anniversary of the murders, police renew public appeals for any information. The case remains one of the largest and most high-profile investigations in Japanese history. The Miyazawa family's relatives and community continue to mourn their loss, haunted by the mystery that refuses to be solved. To this day, the Setagaya family murders remain a terrifying unsolved mystery, one that left behind an abundance of evidence but no answers. The Beast of Ukraine, 1989 to 1996. Anatoly Onoprienko, often referred to as the Beast of Ukraine or the Terminator, is one of the most ruthless serial killers in European history. Between 1989 and 1996, he embarked on a brutal killing spree across Ukraine that left at least 52 people dead. His crimes were not only horrifying in their scale, but also in their cold-blooded efficiency and total lack of remorse. Onoprienko's legacy of terror haunts the country to this day, making him one of the most feared murderers in the post-Soviet era. Born in 1959 in Lasky, Ukraine, Onoprienko's early life was marked by tragedy and hardship. His mother died when he was just 4 years old, and his father, a World War II veteran, was unable to care for him and his siblings. Anatoly was placed in an orphanage, an experience he would later describe as shaping his psyche and feeding his rage. He claimed to have been tormented by feelings of abandonment and resentment toward society, which he would eventually unleash in a horrifying fashion. Onoprienko began his killing spree in 1989, targeting random homes in small Ukrainian villages. His early murders involved robbing isolated households and killing the occupants, usually couples or families. His method was chillingly systematic. He would break into a house, shoot or bludgeon the adults, then kill any children to eliminate witnesses. He used whatever weapon he had available: guns, hammers, axes, and often set fire to the homes to cover his tracks. After a brief hiatus, Onoprienko resumed his spree in 1995, this time escalating in both frequency and brutality. Over a span of just a few months, he killed 43 people in 6 different regions of Ukraine. He would enter homes at night, murdering entire families, sometimes 4 or 5 people at once, and steal valuables and food before leaving. He even killed passers-by who had the misfortune of encountering him during or after his crimes. One of the most shocking aspects of Onoprienko's murders was the indiscriminate nature of his victims. They ranged in age from infants to the elderly, and there was no apparent motive beyond satisfying his bloodlust and taking whatever he wanted. In many cases, he left behind scenes of unimaginable horror: burned homes, mutilated bodies, and entire families wiped out in a single night. Despite the scale of his crimes, Onoprienko managed to evade capture for years, largely due to poor law enforcement infrastructure in post-Soviet Ukraine. Authorities were under immense pressure to find the killer, especially as public panic grew. At one point, they arrested and imprisoned a man named Yuri Mazola, torturing him into a false confession. Mazola died in custody, a tragic and brutal reminder of the chaos surrounding the investigation. In 1996, a breakthrough came. Acting on a tip, police raided a residence where Onoprienko was staying with relatives. Inside his belongings, they found weapons, jewelry, and other items that linked him directly to several murders. He was arrested and taken into custody, where he confessed almost immediately to 52 murders. His confession was cold and emotionless, and he claimed to have been driven by a force inside him that compelled him to kill. During his trial, Onoprienko showed no remorse. He described his victims as rabbits and insects unworthy of life. He even taunted the court, saying that if he had not been caught, he would have continued killing until he reached 360 victims, one for every day of the year. He also blamed society for his actions, pointing to his abandonment as a child and lack of opportunities in the collapsing Soviet Union. In 1999, he was found guilty of 52 counts of murder and sentenced to death. However, in 2000, Ukraine abolished the death penalty, and his sentence was commuted to life in prison. He was incarcerated in a maximum security prison, where he lived in isolation until his death in 2013 from heart failure. To this day, the name Anatoly Onoprienko strikes fear into the hearts of Ukrainians who remember his reign of terror. His case remains a stark reminder of the darkness that can reside within individuals, and how trauma, abandonment, and rage can morph into something monstrous. The Beast of Ukraine, as he came to be known, is a symbol of unchecked evil, one whose crimes still haunt the villages he ravaged, and the nation he terrified. The Alphabet Killer, Rochester, New York, 1971 to 1973. The Alphabet Killer was an unidentified serial killer who terrorized Rochester, New York in the early 1970s. The name Alphabet Killer was coined because of a disturbing pattern found among the known victims. Each had first and last names starting with the same letter, and each was found in a town that began with the same letter as well. The murders remain unsolved to this day, and the mystery surrounding the case has gripped true crime enthusiasts for decades. The first known victim was Karen Cullen, an 11-year-old girl who disappeared on November 16, 1971. Carmen lived in Rochester and was last seen leaving a local pharmacy. She had been sent to pick up a prescription, but never returned home. Her body was discovered 2 days later in Churchville, a small town west of Rochester. She had been assaulted and strangled. The case shocked the community, but despite a large-scale investigation involving state police and the FBI, no suspects were arrested at the time. The case went cold. Less than 2 years later, on April 2nd, 1973, 10-year-old Wanda Wakowicz disappeared while walking home from a grocery store. Wanda, also from Rochester, was a shy and soft-spoken girl who kept to herself. Her disappearance prompted a frantic search, and her body was found the next day in Webster, a suburb east of Rochester. Just like Carmen, Wanda had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The similarities between the two cases were immediately noted. Both girls had matching initials, Carmen Cullen, Wanda Wakowicz, and both were discovered in towns with names beginning with the same letter as their names. Additionally, they had both vanished while running simple errands. The third and final known victim was Michelle Mayenza, an 11-year-old girl who vanished on November 26, 1973, while walking home from school. Her body was found 2 days later in Macedon, another town not far from Rochester. Michelle had also been assaulted and strangled. Once again, her initials matched the town she was found in. Michelle Mayenza in Macedon. The pattern was too distinct to ignore, and authorities were now convinced they were dealing with a serial killer. The media dubbed the perpetrator the Alphabet Killer, and panic swept through Rochester. Parents kept their children indoors, and police urged the public to report any suspicious behavior. Despite a massive investigation and countless interviews, no arrests were made. Several suspects were considered over the years. One was Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle, who had a criminal record and fled to Puerto Rico shortly after her murder. However, there was insufficient evidence to charge him, and he later died in a car accident. Another suspect, Kenneth Bianchi, known as one of the Hillside Stranglers, became a person of interest after his arrest in California for multiple murders. Bianchi had lived in Rochester during the time of the Alphabet murders, but police could not definitively link him to the crimes, and he denied involvement. Investigators believed the killer was familiar with the Rochester area, as the dump sites suggested knowledge of less traveled roads and remote locations. There was also speculation that the killer may have had access to a vehicle and perhaps posed as someone trustworthy, like a police officer or authority figure, to lure the girls. Unfortunately, forensic science in the early 1970s was limited. DNA testing was decades away, and much of the evidence collected could not be properly analyzed. Over time, the leads dried up and the cases grew cold. In recent years, advances in forensic technology prompted authorities to re-examine the evidence, including clothing and biological samples. DNA testing was conducted on several items, but no conclusive matches have been made. The possibility remains that the killer may have died or relocated, taking their secrets with them. The Alphabet Killer remains one of Rochester's most disturbing unsolved cases, and the loss of 3 young girls continues to haunt the community. The eerie pattern of the victims' initials and dump site names has fueled numerous theories. Some believe the matching letters were intentional, suggesting a killer who was methodical and perhaps obsessed with patterns or rituals. Others speculate it could be a grim coincidence, and the killer may have simply chosen victims of opportunity within his own community. Regardless of the motive, the killer's identity remains unknown. To this day, the families of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle have received no closure. Every few years, tips resurface and the cases briefly return to the spotlight, but so far, no arrests have been made. The Alphabet Killer serves as a chilling reminder of how some predators can elude justice, and how even small towns can be rocked by terror. The mystery lingers, and many hope that someday, with advances in DNA and investigative techniques, the killer will finally be unmasked. The Freeway Phantom, Washington, D.C., 1971 to 1972. The Freeway Phantom was an unidentified serial killer who haunted the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area in the early 1970s. Between April 1971 and September 1972, 6 African-American girls aged between 10 and 18 were abducted, assaulted, and murdered. Their bodies were discarded along the highways and roads around D.C., earning the unknown killer the nickname the Freeway Phantom. Despite a prolonged investigation involving local and federal law enforcement, the killer was never caught, and the case remains one of the region's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The first known victim was 13-year-old Carol Spinks. On April the 25th, 1971, she left her southeast D.C. apartment to buy groceries from a nearby 7-Eleven. She never made it back home. 6 days later, her body was discovered along Interstate 295. Carol had been assaulted and strangled. Her shoes were missing and there were no immediate leads. Police were baffled, but suspected she had been abducted shortly after leaving the store. 2 months later, on July 8, 1971, 16-year-old Darlinia Johnson disappeared while on her way to work. Her body was found 11 days later near the same stretch of road where Carol Spinks was found. The remains were badly decomposed, but investigators noted enough similarities between the cases to consider the possibility of a serial offender. Once again, there were no witnesses and no suspects. In July of the same year, 10-year-old Brenda Crockett vanished after being sent to the store by her mother. This case took a chilling turn when Brenda called her home twice during her disappearance. On the first call, she told her younger sister that a white man had kidnapped her, taken her to Virginia, and would return her home soon. She seemed coached or coerced, as though someone was feeding her lines. During the second call, Brenda repeated the same information, but sounded more distressed. Hours later, her body was found on U.S. Route 50. She had been assaulted, strangled, and her feet were bare. The calls to her home marked a disturbing escalation. The killer was toying with the family and law enforcement. The fourth victim was 12-year-old Nanumoshia Yates, who disappeared in October 1971 while walking home. Her body was found within hours, discarded near the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. Like the others, she had been strangled and her shoes were missing. The rapid disposal of her body indicated the killer was growing more brazen and possibly more desperate. The fifth victim, Brenda Woodard, was an 18-year-old high school senior. She disappeared after having dinner with a friend. Her body was found near Route 202 just 6 hours later. A note was found in her coat pocket, and its contents shocked investigators. The note, written in Brenda's handwriting, read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom." It was believed the killer forced her to write the note under duress. The taunting message confirmed that the same individual was responsible for the previous murders and was now actively mocking law enforcement. The sixth and final known victim was 17-year-old Diane Williams, who vanished on September 5th, 1972. She was last seen leaving her boyfriend's home. Her body was discovered hours later along Interstate 295. Like the others, she'd been strangled, but in a slight deviation, no sexual assault was reported. Once again, her shoes were missing, reinforcing a possible ritual or trophy-taking behavior by the killer. The Washington, D.C. community was paralyzed with fear. Parents refused to let their children leave home alone, and schools issued warnings. Despite hundreds of interviews, composite sketches, and roadblocks, investigators couldn't make progress. The FBI joined the case, and several suspects were considered, including a group known as the Green Vega Gang, who were implicated in several abductions. However, nothing tied them conclusively to the murders. Another suspect was a local police officer, but he was cleared due to lack of evidence. The killer's meticulous nature, ability to evade detection, and the disturbing letter suggested a person who was intelligent, organized, and had knowledge of law enforcement procedures. Some believed the killer might have been in a position of authority, possibly a taxi driver, security guard, or someone familiar with the local roadways. The note left in Brenda Woodard's pocket indicated a need for control and a desire to instill fear, possibly suggesting psychopathic tendencies. The murder stopped after Diane Williams, and no further cases have been definitively linked to the Freeway Phantom. Over the years, advancements in forensic technology have prompted cold case reviews, but no DNA evidence has led to a breakthrough. The case remains open, and investigators have not given up hope that one day the killer will be identified. The Freeway Phantom is one of the most chilling examples of a serial killer who targeted vulnerable victims in a tightly knit community and vanished without a trace. The loss of 6 young girls left lasting wounds in Washington, D.C. and the case serves as a grim reminder of how some killers can operate in the shadows, evading justice for decades. The Long Island serial killer, New York, 1996 to 2011. In one of the most disturbing and mysterious serial killer cases in recent American history, the Long Island serial killer, also referred to as the Gilgo Beach Killer, is believed to be responsible for the deaths of at least 10 individuals, mostly sex workers, whose remains were found along the desolate stretches of Ocean Parkway in Suffolk County, New York. The gruesome discoveries began in 2010, but investigators believe that some of the murders may date back as far as 1996. For over a decade, this case baffled law enforcement and terrified the community as the killer remained at large, and the number of victims continued to rise. The case first came to light in May 2010, when 23-year-old Shannon Gilbert, a sex worker from New Jersey, vanished after visiting a client in the Oak Beach area of Long Island. As shortly after midnight, Gilbert had placed a frantic 911 call claiming someone was trying to kill her. Despite an extensive search, she remained missing for months. In December 2010, while police were searching for Gilbert's body near Gilgo Beach, they instead stumbled upon the remains of 4 other women wrapped in burlap sacks. These women were all young sex workers who had advertised services on Craigslist. Over the following months, 6 more sets of remains were discovered in the surrounding areas of Gilgo Beach and Jones Beach, bringing the total number of victims to at least 10. The media dubbed the unknown assailant the Long Island serial killer. The remains found shared chilling similarities. Many of the victims were petite women in their 20s, all with ties to online sex work. The manner in which the bodies were disposed, dismembered, wrapped, and scattered along the isolated coastal road, indicated a methodical and experienced killer. DNA testing helped identify several of the victims, including Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, Amberlynn Costello, and Maureen Brainard Barnes, who are now commonly referred to as the Gilgo Four. Other victims, however, remain unidentified to this day, known only by designations such as Jane Doe No. 6 and Baby Doe. Despite public pressure and national media coverage, the investigation yielded few tangible leads. Law enforcement agencies from local police to the FBI got involved, and various theories about the killer's identity began to circulate. Some believe the killer was a former or current law enforcement officer due to the use of burlap sacks and the precision in body disposal. Others speculated about multiple killers, given the wide time frame and differing MOs. There was also suspicion that the killer was a local resident familiar with the remote beach areas, possibly someone hiding in plain sight. Shannon Gilbert's body was eventually discovered in December 2011, a year after the search began. Her remains were located in a marsh about a mile from where she was last seen. The circumstances of her death, however, sparked controversy. The police claimed her death was accidental, citing drowning and drug use, but her family believes she was murdered by the same serial killer. An independent autopsy later suggested signs of strangulation, but the official cause of death remains undetermined. Gilbert's case continues to be linked, controversially, to the Long Island serial killer mystery. Years passed with little progress. Public frustration grew, particularly over accusations that local law enforcement mishandled evidence or delayed releasing critical information. In 2020, Suffolk County Police finally released a photograph of a belt found near one of the crime scenes, a potential clue they had kept hidden for years. They hoped it would jog the memory of someone who might recognize the item. Then, in July 2023, after more than a decade of dead ends, there was a stunning breakthrough. Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect from Massapequa Park, Long Island, was arrested and charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo Four. Investigators linked Heuermann to the crimes through a combination of cell phone records, burner phones used to contact victims, and DNA recovered from the burlap and other evidence. His arrest shocked the local community, especially because Heuermann lived in the area and had no previous serious criminal record. He was known as a quiet man, married with children, and seemingly led a normal life. Heuermann has pleaded not guilty, and investigations are ongoing to determine if he is responsible for more of the victims found along Ocean Parkway. Law enforcement continues to dig into his past, searching for links to other unsolved murders across the country. the arrest has reignited hope that justice may finally be served for the victims and their families. The Long Island serial killer case is not only a tale of gruesome murders and a decade-long mystery, but also a stark look into how society often overlooks the vulnerable. Many of the victims were sex workers, and some believe the investigation would have progressed faster had they been from different walks of life. As the legal proceedings against Rex Heuermann continue, where questions linger about whether he acted alone, how many victims there truly are, and if all those linked to the Gilgo Beach discoveries will finally be identified and given closure.